We live in a world that mistakes emotional restraint for strength. From childhood, we're taught that crying is weakness, that tears are embarrassing displays better hidden behind closed doors. Society rewards those who keep it together, who smile through pain, who never let anyone see them break. And so we learn to swallow our grief, to compress our sorrow into tight balls of tension that lodge themselves in our throats, our chests, our bodies. The consequence? A generation walking around with emotional pressure cookers inside them, wondering why they feel numb, disconnected, or perpetually on the edge of collapse. But what if the people who cry easily aren't the fragile ones? What if Carl Jung was right when he suggested that tears aren't signs of weakness, but rather evidence of a psyche that hasn't yet learned to lie to itself? Jung spent decades exploring the depths of the human unconscious, and he discovered something profound. The people who cry easily are often those whose connection to their inner world remains unbroken. They haven't yet built the elaborate defenses that separate us from our authentic emotional reality. Their tears aren't dysfunction, they're honesty. Jung's clinical work revealed that many of his patients who appeared strong and composed were actually suffering from severe psychological fragmentation. Meanwhile, those who wept freely in his office often made the fastest progress toward integration and healing. They had access to something precious, an unobstructed channel between their conscious experience and their deeper emotional truth. What Jung called the wounded healer often began as someone who felt too much, cried too easily, and was told their entire life that something was wrong with them. In this video, we're going to explore why your tears might be your greatest psychological asset. You'll discover how emotional sensitivity relates to Jung's concept of individuation, why society's conditioning against crying creates shadow material that haunts us, and how learning to understand, rather than suppress, your emotional nature can lead to profound psychological integration. This isn't about glorifying emotional dysfunction. It's about understanding what your psyche is trying to tell you through tears, and why that message might be exactly what you need to hear. If you're new to the channel and haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button and like the video to support our work. Thank you for your support. Now, let's begin by understanding what Jung observed about emotional expression and the architecture of the psyche. Imagine a pressure valve on a steam engine. When pressure builds, the valve releases it in controlled bursts, preventing the entire system from exploding. Jung noticed that human beings come equipped with similar mechanisms. Emotional release valves that prevent psychological catastrophe. Tears are one such valve, but in modern society, we've been taught to weld these valves shut, to pride ourselves on our ability to withstand infinite internal pressure without ever letting steam escape. Then we wonder why so many people are exploding in more destructive ways. Jung recognized something that most of his contemporaries missed. Emotional expression isn't opposed to psychological strength. It's a prerequisite for it. In his clinical practice, he observed that patients who maintained rigid emotional control often suffered from what he called psychic inflation, a dangerous disconnection between the ego and the unconscious. These were the people who appeared fine for years, even decades, until one day something seemingly minor triggered a complete psychological collapse. Their failure wasn't that they felt too much, it was that they never learned to feel at all. Consider the person who cries during movies, at weddings, while listening to certain songs. Society labels them as too sensitive and overly emotional, dramatic, but Jung would have seen something different. He would have recognized someone whose psyche remains permeable, whose ego boundaries haven't yet calcified into impenetrable armor. This person still has access to what Jung called the collective unconscious, that deep reservoir of human experience and emotion that connects us all. Their tears aren't weakness. They're proof that they haven't yet sealed themselves off from the depths. The problem isn't that you cry easily. The problem is that you've been taught to interpret this psychological gift as a liability. From the time you were a child, adults around you likely responded to your tears with discomfort, dismissal, or even anger. Stop crying. Big boys don't cry. You're being too sensitive. Each of these messages landed in your psyche like a small wound, teaching you that your natural emotional responses were somehow wrong, shameful, inappropriate. Over time, these wounds accumulated into what Jung would call a complex, an emotionally charged psychological pattern that operates semi-autonomously within the psyche. Jung's research into what he termed feeling types revealed something fascinating. In his system of psychological types, some people are naturally oriented toward feeling as their primary function of consciousness. These individuals don't just experience emotions, they use emotion as their primary way of evaluating and understanding the world. For them, crying easily isn't a bug in their psychological operating system. It's a feature. It's how their psyche processes information, makes meaning, and maintains connection with both their inner world and the world around them. Throughout his career, Jung worked with hundreds of patients who came to him because they felt broken by their emotional sensitivity. Many had been told by previous therapists to develop coping mechanisms, to toughen up, to learn to control their emotional responses. But Jung took a radically different approach. Instead of trying to suppress or eliminate their sensitivity, he helped them understand it as a valuable psychological function. He showed them that their tears contained information, messages from the unconscious that demanded attention. What Jung discovered was startling. The patients who learned to honor their emotional nature, including their tendency to cry, often experienced what he called individuation more rapidly than those who spent years building emotional defenses. Individuation, Jung's term for the process of becoming psychologically whole, requires brutal honesty with oneself. It requires acknowledging the full spectrum of what exists within the psyche. People who cry easily often have a head start on this process because they haven't yet learned to lie to themselves about what they're feeling. But here's where it gets complex. Jung also observed that many people who cry easily are caught in what he called participation mystique, an unconscious identification with the emotions of others and the emotional atmosphere around them. They cry not just for their own pain, but for the collective pain they sense in the room, in their relationships, in the world. This can be overwhelming, even debilitating, if they don't learn to differentiate between what belongs to them and what belongs to others. The tears are real, but they're not always personal. The cultural conditioning against crying has created an enormous psychological problem. We've essentially taught entire generations to disconnect from one of the most fundamental human functions, the emotional release and communication system. Jung warned that whatever we repress in the conscious mind doesn't disappear. It sinks into the shadow, that part of the psyche containing everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. For many people, their capacity for tears, for authentic emotional expression, has been banished to the shadow. And from there, it haunts them. Jung would say that the question isn't, why do I cry so easily? The real question is, what is my psyche trying to integrate through these tears? Because tears are never just tears. They're the psyche's attempt to bring something from the unconscious into consciousness, to make visible what has been hidden, to acknowledge what has been denied. When you cry, you're not being weak. You're participating in one of the most ancient and essential psychological processes, the movement toward wholeness. If you identified with this exploration of emotional sensitivity, click the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for your support. Now that we understand the problem, society's fundamental misunderstanding of emotional expression, we need to explore Jung's revolutionary perspective on what tears actually represent in the landscape of the psyche. Most people misunderstand what Jung meant by psychological integration. They imagine it as achieving some state of peaceful equilibrium, of finally getting all your emotions under control. But Jung's vision was far more radical than that. He believed that integration meant acknowledging and incorporating every aspect of yourself, including the parts that weep, that break down, that feel overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of being alive. For Jung, the goal wasn't to stop crying. It was to understand what the tears were saying. Jung introduced a concept he called the transcendent function, the psyche's innate ability to hold opposing forces in tension until something new emerges. This wasn't just theory for Jung. It was forged in the crucible of his own psychological crisis. Between 1913 and 1917, Jung experienced what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological turmoil that many of his colleagues thought might end in complete breakdown. During this time, Jung didn't try to suppress his emotional storms. Instead, he documented them, engaged with them, allowed them to move through him. What Jung did during those years was extraordinary. He withdrew from his university position, limited his clinical practice, and spent hours each day in what he called active imagination, a technique where he deliberately descended into his unconscious mind and engaged with whatever emerged. He kept detailed journals of these encounters. He painted, drew, sculpted. He allowed himself to experience the full force of his psychological depths, including emotions so powerful they brought him to tears, to his knees, to the edge of what felt like madness. This wasn't some mystical, romantic journey. It was brutal, exhausting, terrifying work. Jung later wrote that there were days when he had to remind himself to breathe, to eat, to maintain basic functioning. His family worried. His colleagues gossiped. The professional reputation he'd built stood on the edge of ruin. But Jung persisted because he understood something crucial. The only way out of psychological fragmentation is through it. The only way to integrate what has been split off is to turn toward it, not away from it. During this period, Jung cried. He cried for losses he hadn't acknowledged, for wounds he'd carried since childhood, for the terrifying realization that the orderly conscious mind he'd built was floating on an ocean of unconscious forces that dwarfed it completely. But these weren't tears of defeat. They were tears of recognition, of the psyche finally acknowledging what it had spent years avoiding. Every tear carved a channel between his conscious and unconscious minds, creating the pathways that would eventually allow integration to occur. What emerged from Jung's confrontation with his unconscious became the foundation for his most important work. The concepts of archetypes, the collective unconscious, the process of individuation, all of these grew from Jung's willingness to face his own psychological depths without flinching. And central to that willingness was his refusal to suppress his emotional responses. He allowed himself to feel everything, to cry when the psyche demanded tears, to tremble when he encountered forces within himself that terrified him. Jung came to understand that emotional intensity isn't the opposite of psychological health. It's often the doorway to it. The psyche speaks in the language of emotion. When something in the unconscious needs to become conscious, it doesn't send a polite memo. It sends a feeling, an image, a dream, or it sends tears. People who cry easily are receiving constant communications from their unconscious. The question is whether they learn to read these messages or spend their lives ashamed of receiving them. Jung discovered that the psyche has its own intelligence, its own agenda, its own timetable for integration. You can't force this process. You can't will yourself into wholeness. What you can do is learn to recognize when the psyche is trying to get your attention, and tears are one of its most urgent signals. When you cry, your unconscious is knocking on the door of consciousness, holding something it needs you to see, to feel, to integrate. For Jung, the person who cries easily hasn't yet built the elaborate defenses that most people construct between their ego and their unconscious. This can feel vulnerable, even dangerous in a world that values emotional control, but it's also a kind of psychological transparency, an openness to the depths that makes genuine transformation possible. Jung would have told you that your tears aren't the problem requiring solution. They're the solution trying to happen. The true work, then, isn't learning to stop crying. It's learning to understand what each tear represents, what part of your unconscious is trying to break through into awareness, what aspect of yourself is demanding integration. This requires a shift from seeing tears as embarrassing leaks to recognizing them as valuable psychological information. It requires developing what Jung called a symbolic attitude, the ability to read the language of the psyche. But recognizing that tears carry meaning is only the beginning. The question becomes practical. How do you work with this emotional intensity? How do you honor your sensitivity without being overwhelmed by it? How do you differentiate between tears that signal necessary psychological work and tears that simply reflect emotional contagion from others? Jung developed specific practices for this, methods that don't suppress emotion but channel it toward integration. And that's where we need to turn our attention now. Jung's approach to working with emotional intensity wasn't about developing better coping mechanisms or learning to regulate your feelings. It was about establishing what he called a conscious relationship with the unconscious. This meant creating structured ways to engage with the forces that produced your tears, to understand them, to integrate their messages. He developed a fourfold approach that transformed emotional sensitivity from a burden into a tool for psychological development. The first pillar Jung emphasized was what he called active imagination, a practice of deliberately engaging with the images, emotions, and figures that emerge from your unconscious. When tears come, instead of immediately wiping them away or distracting yourself, you pause. You ask, what image is behind this emotion? If this feeling were a person, what would they look like? What would they say? You allow the emotion to generate imagery, then you engage with that imagery consciously. Jung would have you write dialogues with these inner figures, paint them, sculpt them, anything that gives them form and allows conscious engagement. This isn't suppression. It's transformation of raw emotion into psychological material you can work with. The second pillar involved what Jung called withdrawing projections. He observed that people who cry easily often carry an unconscious burden. They feel not just their own pain, but the pain of everyone around them. They cry at movies because they're projecting their own unacknowledged grief onto fictional characters. They weep at others' stories because they're finally giving themselves permission to feel what they've repressed about their own lives. Jung's practice here was ruthlessly honest. Whose emotion is this really? What in my own life does this remind me of? Where have I experienced this before? This kind of questioning begins to separate your authentic emotional responses from the projections and identifications that amplify them. The third pillar was establishing what Jung called a regular practice of self-examination. This wasn't casual journaling or surface-level reflection. Jung advocated for a daily practice of sitting with your emotional experiences, recording them, analyzing them for patterns and symbols. He recommended documenting not just what you felt, but what images accompanied the feelings, what memories surfaced, what thoughts arose. Over time, this practice reveals the recurring themes, the complexes, the unintegrated aspects of yourself that keep triggering emotional responses. You begin to see that you don't cry randomly. You cry when something touches a specific wound, activates a particular complex, or when the unconscious is trying to bring something important to your attention. The fourth pillar Jung emphasized was what he called opus contra naturam, work against nature, or the deliberate practice of doing what doesn't come naturally in order to achieve balance. For people who cry easily, this often meant learning to hold tension without immediate emotional release, not suppression, tension holding. When tears come, you don't immediately give in to them or push them away. Instead, you sit with the discomfort, feeling the pressure build, observing what happens when you don't take the habitual route of either expressing or repressing. Jung believed this conscious holding of opposing forces was essential for activating the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to generate something new from the tension. Jung himself practiced these methods relentlessly during his confrontation with the unconscious. He would spend hours in what he called the tower, a retreat he built specifically for this inner work. There, isolated from social demands and professional obligations, he engaged in active imagination, recorded his dreams and visions, painted the images that emerged, and sat with the overwhelming emotions that surfaced. He discovered that when you stop running from your emotional intensity and instead turn toward it with consciousness, it begins to reveal its purpose. The key to Jung's approach was consciousness. He didn't advocate for cathartic release, just crying whenever you felt like it with no awareness or structure. Nor did he recommend stoic suppression. He advocated for conscious engagement, bringing awareness to what triggered your tears, what they revealed about your inner landscape, what aspects of yourself were trying to break through into consciousness. This required discipline, patience, and an unflinching willingness to see yourself clearly. For Jung, working with tears meant treating them as a kind of psychological symptom. Not in the medical sense of something wrong, but in the sense of something meaningful. Just as a dream symptom, a recurring image or theme, points toward unconscious content that needs integration, tears are symptomatic of the psyche's movement toward wholeness. Each time you cry, some part of your unconscious is trying to become conscious. Your task isn't to stop the tears, but to understand what they're bringing you. But here's the essential warning Jung would offer. This work cannot be superficial. You can't just read about these concepts and expect transformation. The practices must be lived, embodied, repeated until they become second nature. Jung spent years, not weeks or months, engaging in these methods. He understood that psychological integration is the work of a lifetime, not a weekend workshop. The person who cries easily has been given a gift, direct access to their emotional depths. But like any gift, it requires cultivation, understanding, and discipline to use effectively. And this brings us to the most difficult part of Jung's teaching, the confrontation that makes all this work real. Because at some point, if you're truly engaging with your emotional nature rather than just indulging it, you will have to face something terrifying. You will have to confront the reason you cry so easily. You will have to look directly at the wound, the complex, the unintegrated aspect of yourself that generates this sensitivity. And that confrontation changes everything. There comes a moment in this work when the practices you've been doing suddenly stop feeling like exercises and start feeling like an ordeal. You sit down for what you think will be a normal session of active imagination, but what emerges isn't some gentle inner figure offering wisdom. It's rage, it's shame, it's the memory you've spent 30 years avoiding. It's the part of yourself you've exiled to the shadow because you couldn't stand to acknowledge its existence. And suddenly you're not just crying because you're sensitive. You're crying because you're finally facing what you've run from your entire life. Jung called this the confrontation with the shadow, and he was unequivocal about its necessity. The shadow isn't just the negative qualities you've repressed, your anger, your selfishness, your cruelty. It's also the positive qualities you were never allowed to express, your strength, your boundaries, your authentic needs. For many people who cry easily, a significant portion of their shadow contains their capacity for healthy aggression, for saying no, for protecting themselves emotionally. They cry because they never learned to fight, to resist, to stand their ground. The tears are what's left when you've stripped yourself of every other form of self-assertion. When you finally confront this, when you sit in meditation or active imagination and the shadow emerges, your first instinct will be to flee. Your mind will generate 1,000 distractions. Suddenly you'll remember urgent emails, household chores, anything to pull you away from what's surfacing. But if you stay, if you resist the urge to escape, something remarkable happens. The tears that come aren't the familiar tears of overwhelm or sensitivity. They're different, deeper. These are the tears Jung called transformative. They're not just expressing emotion, they're releasing something that's been held in the psyche for decades. This is when you discover why your psyche has been using tears as its primary language. Somewhere, usually in childhood, you learned that crying was the only form of emotional expression that was acceptable, or at least tolerated. Maybe overt anger was forbidden, maybe expressing joy was mocked, maybe asserting your needs resulted in punishment. So your psyche adapted. It channeled everything through the one outlet that remained: tears. Every emotion you couldn't express any other way got funneled into crying. And now, decades later, you cry at everything because tears have become your psyche's universal solvent. Sitting with this realization is excruciating. It means acknowledging that your emotional sensitivity isn't just a personality trait. It's a survival adaptation. It's what you created to navigate an environment that didn't allow you to be fully human. Jung understood that this moment of recognition is when real transformation becomes possible. Because now you're not just crying, you're seeing why you cry, you're making conscious what has been unconscious. And once something becomes conscious, you have a choice about it. As Jung wrote in his private journals, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The tears you've shed your entire life have been trying to make something dark, something repressed, denied, exiled, visible to consciousness. But you couldn't see it until you were willing to sit with the discomfort, to face the shadow, to acknowledge what your tears were really about. This is the brutal honesty Jung demanded from his patients and from himself. The psyche will test you here. Just when you think you've had your big realization, another layer emerges. You discover that beneath the first wound is a second wound. Beneath the second wound is a third. Jung called this peeling the onion of the psyche, and he warned that it required immense courage to continue. Many of his patients stopped here, satisfied with surface insights, unwilling to descend further. But those who persisted, those who kept crying, kept feeling, kept confronting, they were the ones who achieved what Jung called true individuation. What you find when you go deep enough is simultaneously devastating and liberating. You find the part of yourself that was never allowed to exist. The child who needed protection but received neglect, the adolescent who needed guidance but got criticism, the adult who needed companionship but learned to expect abandonment. These aren't just memories. They're living presences in your psyche, frozen at the moment of their wounding, still feeling everything they felt then. Your tears have been their voice, crying out for recognition across decades of silence. Jung discovered that these wounded parts of the psyche don't want to be fixed or healed in the conventional sense. They want to be seen, acknowledged, integrated. They want consciousness brought to bear on their suffering. When you finally give them this, when you sit with the part of yourself that cries and simply acknowledge it, honor it, refuse to shame it, something shifts. The tears don't stop, but they change quality. They become tears of release rather than tears of desperation. They become evidence of integration rather than symptoms of fragmentation. This is the function of the descent into darkness that Jung described. It's not about wallowing in pain or dramatizing suffering. It's about retrieving the parts of yourself that were lost, abandoned, or exiled because they didn't fit the image others demanded you maintain. People who cry easily are often those whose truest, most authentic self was never welcome in the world they inhabited. So that self went underground, into the unconscious. And from there, it weeps, not with weakness, but with the fierce insistence of everything in you that refuses to remain buried forever. The confrontation doesn't end in a single moment of cathartic breakdown. It's a process that continues, spiraling deeper with each iteration, but something does shift. You begin to recognize the feeling that precedes tears, the rising pressure in your chest, the tightness in your throat, as a signal that something unconscious is trying to break through. Instead of being hijacked by emotion, you develop what Jung called the observing ego. The capacity to experience intense feeling while simultaneously maintaining awareness of what you're experiencing. This isn't dissociation, it's integration. It's the ego and the unconscious finally learning to coexist. After the confrontation comes something Jung called the integration phase, a period where the insights gained from facing your shadow begin to transform how you move through the world. This isn't a dramatic, visible change. No trumpet sound, no one throws you a parade. In fact, from the outside, you might appear exactly the same. You still cry easily, you're still emotionally sensitive, but inside, everything is different. The tears no longer control you. You've learned their language. You understand what they're saying. The first thing you notice is the quality of your presence shifts. You're still emotional, but there's a groundedness beneath the emotion that wasn't there before. Where you used to be swept away by every feeling, carried along by emotional currents you couldn't name or understand, now you can feel intensely while remaining centered. It's not that the feelings are less powerful. It's that you've developed capacity to hold them, to let them move through you without destroying you. Jung called this the birth of the psychological individual, the emergence of someone who knows themselves at depth. But here's what's strange. Other people notice something different about you, even if they can't articulate what it is. The person who used to see your tears and feel uncomfortable now feels inexplicably moved. The friend who dismissed your sensitivity now finds themselves opening up to you about things they've never told anyone. You haven't become stronger in the traditional sense. You've become more genuinely yourself, and genuine presence has a magnetic quality that transcends conventional definitions of strength or weakness. The irony is profound. You spent years trying to stop crying, trying to toughen up, trying to be less sensitive, because you thought that's what would make you acceptable to others. But what actually makes you magnetic, what actually draws people to you, is the very quality you were trying to eliminate. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his practice. Patients who learned to honor their sensitivity became more psychologically integrated than those who spent their energy trying to suppress it. The acceptance of your nature, not its denial, is what liberates you. Something else happens in this phase. You begin to see other people's emotional defenses with startling clarity. The friend who never cries and prides themselves on being rational, you now recognize the massive amount of psychological energy they're spending to maintain that facade. The colleague who mocks emotional expression, you can see the terror beneath their contempt, the fear that if they let themselves feel anything, everything they've suppressed might come flooding out. You don't judge them for this, you just see it. And seeing it makes you grateful that you never fully succeeded in building those defenses yourself. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the wounded healer, the idea that those who have descended into their own psychological depths and returned are uniquely equipped to help others make the same journey. Your capacity to cry easily, once you've integrated what it means and represents, becomes a kind of psychological gift. You can sit with others' pain without being overwhelmed by it. You can witness their suffering without needing to fix it or flee from it. You've learned to hold emotional intensity without collapsing, and that capacity is precisely what someone in crisis needs from another human being. As Jung would say, you've learned to separate what's yours from what belongs to others. You still feel deeply, still cry easily, but now you can distinguish between tears that arise from your own unintegrated material and tears that reflect empathic resonance with another's experience. This differentiation is crucial. It means you're no longer just an emotional sponge, soaking up everyone's pain indiscriminately. You've developed what Jung called boundaries in the psyche, the ability to be open and sensitive without losing yourself in the process. The transformation shows up in unexpected ways. You find yourself crying during a movie, but you're also aware that you're crying. You can observe and experience simultaneously. You tear up during a friend's story of loss, but you can hold space for their grief without making it about your own unprocessed sorrow. You feel overwhelmed by the beauty of a sunset or a piece of music, but the overwhelm doesn't frighten you because you understand it as the psyche's response to genuine contact with something transcendent. People who don't understand this integration often mistake it for having gotten over your sensitivity. They think you've finally toughened up, finally learned to control your emotions. But that's not what's happened. What's happened is that you've stopped fighting your nature and learned to work with it. You've stopped seeing your tears as evidence of weakness and recognized them as evidence of contact with the depths. This isn't healing in the sense of making something damaged normal again. This is individuation, becoming more fully who you actually are. Jung believed that the return from the underworld of the psyche wasn't the end of the journey, but the beginning of its practical application. You don't integrate your shadow, confront your wounds, and understand your tears just for your own benefit. The process makes demands on you. It asks you to live differently, to show up in the world with the authenticity you've discovered in the depths. For Jung, psychological integration was never just about personal happiness. It was about becoming capable of contributing something genuine to the collective. The quality that disturbs others most about you now isn't your tears. It's your refusal to pretend. You've stopped performing emotional strength when you don't feel strong. You've stopped apologizing for your nature. You've stopped contorting yourself to fit others' expectations of how an emotionally healthy person should behave. This authenticity is deeply threatening to people who've built their entire identity around emotional control and performance. Your mere existence challenges their defensive structure. But for those who are ready, who are themselves struggling with their emotional nature or their disconnection from it, you become a kind of permission. Your willingness to cry, to feel, to remain sensitive in a world that punishes sensitivity shows them that another way is possible. You don't preach this, you don't even talk about it necessarily, you just live it. And that living becomes an invitation for others to consider that maybe, just maybe, the thing they've been taught to see as their greatest weakness might actually be their greatest gift. The change ripples outward in ways you can't track or measure. A person sees you cry and gives themselves permission to acknowledge their own unshed tears. A friend watches you honor your sensitivity and decides to stop pretending to be tougher than they are. A colleague observes your emotional honesty and begins questioning the emotional performance they've maintained for decades. You've become what Jung called a carrier of transformation, not through what you say or teach, but through what you embody. Jung would remind you that this isn't about being perfect or having completed the work. Individuation isn't a destination, it's an ongoing process. You'll still have days when you're overwhelmed by your sensitivity, when you wish you could just turn it off and be normal. You'll still encounter situations where your tears are misunderstood, where your emotional intensity is too much for the people around you, but now you have something you didn't have before: understanding. You know why you're built this way. You know what purpose your tears serve. You know that your sensitivity isn't a flaw to be corrected, but a feature to be honored. And that knowledge changes everything. Not because it makes life easier. Jung never promised that integration would make life easy, but because it makes life more meaningful. You're no longer a passive victim of your emotional nature. You're a conscious participant in your psychological development. Your tears are no longer something that happens to you. They're something you understand, work with, and ultimately integrate into the totality of who you are. This is what Jung meant by becoming whole, not eliminating parts of yourself, but bringing them all into conscious relationship with each other. And this brings us to a question Jung would pose directly. What happens now that you understand this? Because understanding without action is just intellectual comfort. The real test is whether you're willing to live as if your emotional nature, including your tendency to cry, is valid, valuable, and worth protecting in a world that will constantly pressure you to suppress it. This requires a particular kind of courage, one that Jung spent his life exploring. For Jung, courage wasn't the absence of fear or vulnerability. It was the willingness to remain open to your inner experience even when the outer world punished that openness. This is what he called the moral courage of individuation. The decision to honor what's true in your psyche, even when it's inconvenient, even when it makes you strange, even when it costs you socially or professionally. People who cry easily are being offered a specific test. Will you honor what you've discovered about your nature, or will you go back to trying to be someone you're not? The path Jung described requires what he called the alchemical process, a transformation that occurs not through force, but through conscious engagement with the raw material of your psyche. Alchemy, in Jung's symbolic system, wasn't about turning lead into gold. It was about transforming unconscious material into consciousness, taking what was base and rejected and discovering its hidden value. Your tears are the lead. Your integrated understanding of what they represent and communicate is the gold. But the transformation only happens through the work, through the daily practice of bringing consciousness to what was unconscious. Jung understood something that most therapeutic approaches miss. Psychological transformation isn't comfortable. It requires you to sit with tensions that feel unbearable. It demands that you hold contradictions without resolving them prematurely. You're sensitive and strong. You cry easily, and you're deeply courageous. You feel overwhelmed, and you're profoundly capable. These aren't problems to solve, they're paradoxes to hold. The psyche grows not through eliminating contradictions, but through learning to contain them with increasing consciousness. The challenge Jung would place before you is this: can you accept that your emotional sensitivity is both gift and burden, strength and vulnerability, asset and liability, all at once? Can you stop trying to make your tears only positive or only negative, and instead see them as a complex psychological phenomenon that serves multiple functions simultaneously? This kind of nuanced thinking, this refusal of simple answers, is the hallmark of psychological maturity in Jung's system. For Jung, true freedom wasn't freedom from your nature. It was freedom to be your nature fully, consciously and with choice. You can't choose whether tears come easily to you. That's your constitutional reality, possibly inherited, possibly shaped by early experience, possibly both. But you can choose how you relate to that reality. You can choose to bring consciousness to it rather than shame. You can choose to explore what it reveals about your inner world rather than suppress it. You can choose to integrate it into your identity rather than seeing it as a flaw to overcome. What emerges from this choice is what Jung called the birth of the self. Not the ego self, that small conscious identity you present to the world, but the larger self, the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, strength and sensitivity. The person who learns to honor their tears without being controlled by them, who understands their emotional intensity without being defined by it, who can feel deeply while remaining grounded, this person has achieved something rare. They've become psychologically integrated in a world that promotes fragmentation. The most profound aspect of Jung's teaching on this is that your sensitivity, once integrated, becomes a tool for seeing what others miss. You notice the emotional undercurrents in a room that others are oblivious to. You sense when someone is suffering behind their smile. You feel the collective tensions, the unspoken conflicts, the hidden grief that permeates human interaction. What was once overwhelming emotional input becomes valuable psychological information. You've learned to read the language of emotion the way others read the language of text. This isn't about becoming superhuman or transcending your human limitations. Jung was ruthlessly honest about the fact that individuation doesn't eliminate suffering. It changes your relationship to suffering. You'll still hurt, you'll still cry, you'll still have moments of feeling too much, too deeply, too intensely, but you'll understand these moments differently. You'll see them not as failures of emotional control, but as moments when your psyche is engaged in the essential work of remaining connected to the depths of human experience. The Carl Jung issues is simple but demanding. Stop running from what you are. Stop apologizing for your tears. Stop trying to become someone less sensitive, less emotional, less intense. Instead, turn toward your nature with curiosity, consciousness, and courage. Understand it, work with it, integrate it, transform it from something that happens to you into something you consciously participate in. This is the work, this is the path. This is what individuation looks like for those who carry the gift and burden of crying easily. What part of yourself have you exiled to the shadow because the world told you it was too much? What would it mean to turn toward that part with consciousness rather than shame? Share your thoughts in the comments or sit with these questions in silence. Both are valid forms of engagement with your psyche. Jung believed that the person who learned to honor their emotional nature, including their tears, was on the path toward genuine psychological wholeness. He would say that your sensitivity isn't something to overcome, but something to understand, integrate, and ultimately transform into one of your greatest psychological assets. If this video helped you see your tears differently or gave you permission to honor your emotional nature, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the human psyche through Carl Jung. Until the next video.